Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W. We're continuing our discussion here of democracy and American culture from 1820 to 1840. And in this lecture, we're going to talk about the election of Andrew Jackson in 1828 and some of his policies during his first term. In 1828, those old rivals, John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson, squared off again in the presidential election that year. Jackson's star seemed to be on the rise. He was, as I've described, a military hero and kind of a hero of the frontier. John Quincy Adams was trying to hold together a sort of throwback to an earlier day, almost a federalist ideal in the tradition of his father. And people of John Quincy Adams' era viewed Andrew Jackson as kind of a frightening prospect, being accompanied by the rise of what will come to be known as King Mob, and we'll talk about that idea in just a moment. Andrew Jackson's campaign was aided by Martin Van Buren, who was a senator from New York, who shared some of Jackson's kind of frontier ideals. Van Buren and his supporters sometimes wore hats with a deer's tail on them, and his supporters came to be called bucktails because of that. But Van Buren supported a coalition between the planters of the Old South and Northern Republicans. And so this helped Andrew Jackson really solidify a powerful voting base that would be enough to prevail in the Electoral College. Andrew Jackson also felt personally stung at what had transpired in the election of 1824. And he and his supporters attacked John Quincy Adams viciously throughout this campaign, slinging all kinds of insults and accusations at John Quincy Adams, who responded in kind. This was almost without question the ugliest presidential campaign to that point. Both sides accused the other of sexual improprieties, for instance, and there were all kinds of insults thrown from both sides. But Jackson's campaign also deployed some very successful and above-board tactics as well. His supporters described him as Old Hickory, again, this kind of frontier and military hero, and contrasted that with John Quincy Adams as this kind of New England elitist. Jackson's supporters also developed what are in some ways very modern techniques of fundraising. He hosted public banquets and other events, and they sold all kinds of paraphernalia with Andrew Jackson's picture or nickname on it. In fact, what you're looking at here is a picture from a cigar box with Old Hickory on it. And there were many other things like that that were sold to raise money for the campaign. This presidential election saw more voters than ever before turn out and vote for the presidency. And in the end, Andrew Jackson won more than twice as many electoral votes as John Quincy Adams to secure the presidency. Andrew Jackson's broad appeal and the extension of democracy to newfound corners of the country was noted even on his inauguration day. The famous painting you see here shows Americans of all stripes gathering outside the Capitol on his inauguration day and thronging to the White House, joining in the celebration. As one person commented, thousands and thousands of people without distinction of rank collected in an immense mass around the Capitol. Not everyone was so happy about this, though. As Supreme Court Justice Joseph Story commented, this inauguration had ushered in the reign of King Mob. Recall that John Quincy Adams had refused to use his powers of appointment merely to grant favors to his friends. Andrew Jackson was not above that sort of thing, although at the end of the day, he only appointed about 20% of federal officials, replacing those who were already in place. But he was not above putting in his friends and supporters into these offices, which many described as the spoils system. Jackson's first term was also tainted somewhat by a scandal in Washington known as the Eaton Affair, in which the wife of one of the president's close friends and his Secretary of War, John Eaton, his wife, Peggy, was kind of smeared as a promiscuous woman in Washington. Among those who had written her off of the social circle in Washington was Floride Calhoun, who was the wife of John Calhoun, the vice president. And so this scandal kind of touched on immediate friends and companions of both the president and vice president, and drove something of a wedge between Jackson and Calhoun. The divide between Jackson and many people in Washington over this affair inspired him to replace a number of his cabinet officials in 1831. Far more threatening to the well-being of the country than a mere scandalous Washington affair was the Nullification crisis. This brought to light the issue of states' rights, which we've already talked about briefly when we talked about the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions that had been drawn up by Jefferson and Madison in an earlier day. But those resolutions had established a precedent that would come to light much more extensively in 1828 and following that. The issue that really sparked this debate were high tariffs on imported goods, which were implemented in 1828. This really vexed John C. Calhoun, one of the leading members from South Carolina and vice president, which we've just discussed. And South Carolinians objected to this tariff on imports, largely because they were concerned that it would lead to a retaliatory tariff on cotton, which would hurt their primary export. John C. Calhoun, forced to side with his constituents in this matter, became one of the champions of the states' rights movement and nullification. This idea built on that had been forwarded by Jefferson and Madison previously, but took things even further, arguing that an individual state could call a special convention to nullify federal laws that they didn't think were constitutional. This idea is nullification, that states can nullify a federal law. Nullification met a formidable opponent in Daniel Webster of Massachusetts, another of the towering figures of this era. He was a senator at that time, and he attacked the idea of nullification in a blistering speech in the Senate, which concluded with the famous phrase, "Liberty and union, now and forever, one and inseparable." Webster, along with many others, simply denied that the states could nullify federal law and treat the constitutionality of such laws at their own whim. Andrew Jackson surprised many by siding with Daniel Webster in this argument, and at a famous dinner honoring the memory of Thomas Jefferson, where Jackson, Calhoun, and many others were gathered, Jefferson gave a toast including the phrase, "Our federal union, it must be preserved." And many people gasped in that moment that Andrew Jackson took the side of Daniel Webster. Vice President Calhoun gave his own toast, in which he said, "The Union, next to our liberties, the most dear." But Calhoun realized that he could no longer serve in Jackson's close proximity and honor his own beliefs in support of his home state of South Carolina, and thus he resigned from the vice presidency and was shortly thereafter elected to the Senate from South Carolina. Issues of states' rights and nullification lingered almost throughout Jackson's entire presidency. In 1832, Congress passed another Tariff Act, which was intended to be conciliatory towards South Carolina, lowering tariffs. But South Carolinians still took this as an affront, and at that point called a convention and issued a declaration declaring the tariff nullified. This is bringing us close to a real constitutional crisis at that point. Congress passed a force bill authorizing the president to use military force if necessary to collect the revenue from the tariffs, which is bringing us to the brink of conflict between the Union and South Carolina. But as he so often did, working behind the scenes, Henry Clay, the great conciliator, worked towards a compromise. And even as Congress passed the force bill, Clay negotiated a bill lowering the tariffs even further. And at that point, South Carolina withdrew its Nullification Act. And so once again, Henry Clay has helped the nation to avert crisis with